You are now.
Hi. I'm not sure how many people are here or how this will work, but we'll just get on with it anyway. Hi, I'm Danielle Brathwaite-Shirley. I'm an artist and archival activist. And today I'll be giving you a talk on removing passiveness from work. Something about passiveness is that I often feel that when audiences view artwork, they can view it from a position of comfort, kind of taking in as much as they want and leaving in as much out as they need to. And for me, I really want to engage their audience, and I find it increasingly important for the audience to be directly engaged and challenged when looking at artwork. So for this presentation, I don't want any passive audience members. So everyone watching, I hope will join in and write in the chat when I ask a question that needs to be answered, as this chat requires everyone's participation to be completed. If there's no participation, then the talk cannot be completed. And so you'll understand more as I go on in the talk. And so I shall just begin. So this is a presentation alongside a story. You will make the choices of where we go, what I talk about, and what we discuss. This will require your participation either vocally or within the chat. This is not a passive presentation. We have been told that what we seek resides somewhere in the vast ocean. After saying goodbye to the land, we board our boat and scour its surface to find something known as the wound of the ocean. As we set off, we are alerted that we are being followed across the sea. Some time into our journey, and after losing track of the ocean we knew, we see the ocean split as though two different liquids were meeting each other. One is full of shadows, and the other has towering waves that crash down upon each other. So we can either sail towards the shadows, sail towards the strong waves, or there's no participation. And I shall wait. Anyone going to write in the chat? And I'll give you some time. That's everyone watching, and I can see there's some people in the thing. So some people can write in the chat. No. Okay. No participation. Okay, so I put this visitor's pass here as a starting point. Often, when people come and look at work made by anyone really, they often feel like they have a pass that allows them to act as they want. They usually look at the work based upon how they want to feel and react to it. And just as you have kind of shown me, often it's without any action. Often it's as though they don't have to do anything. They feel more comfortable, you feel more comfortable, I should say, sitting there and actually not putting any effort in and expecting all the effort to be put in for you. For me, this kind of passiveness, this inactivity, has caused so much pain in the past and continues to do so. And so when I'm thinking about making work, I often think about what if no one makes a choice? What if no one decides to take part in it? And for me, if you do not take part in my work or in the work I am making, the space I am making, then you're not welcome in the space. Then you have done something that's actively withdrawing your labor. And so I withdraw the work from you. You decide not to take part and put all the emphasis on one person, Could this be a reflection of the choices you make in life? You have 2 more chances to participate. Or, if you fail both times, the talk will end. You will be responsible for this. And so we're back here at the choice. Okay, so the choices are either sail towards the shadows or sail towards the strong waves. Are there any choices? Let's see. Strong waves. We have 1 for strong waves. Anyone else? Strong waves. Okay, strong waves is the way. And now read first and then talk. These strong waves are the lost emotions of the sea. The waves here are so strong. It's hard to stand up. Wow, as the water pushes the body of the ship around violently. It seems this part of the sea finds your presence here offensive. The group wants to leave as they are worried the boat will be destroyed, and all of you will be lost with it. We discuss with the group where to go. And so first, let me talk about this image. So this is the image of Mary Jones, who's a black trans woman, I think in the 1836, in 1836. And this is the only visible representation we have of her. And this poster was made in order to warn people of essentially black trans people, of the trans imagery, the trans illusion. And I brought this up because a lot of my work is actually about archiving and about challenging what archives actually do and how archives record and store stories and people. And this is a clear example of why the archive needs to be challenged. This is the only thing left of Mary Jones, a black trans woman in the 19th century. And sadly, it's such a violent image of a warning of people like her. And so if we let the archive continually archive people like me like this, then that violence is archived alongside them, which helps to erase the story and history they actually have. And so for me, when I am thinking about archives, I'm often thinking about how can we center the people that we're trying to archive before we even put the stories in. And without that, you create a system which actually can, again, erase and destroy the memory of those that you're trying to remember. Now, clearly, they weren't trying to remember Mary Jones in any way or any meaningful way. Instead, they were trying to embed an idea of what a trans person is and why you should be scared of them. And this is something that we have in the archive. We have the fears around transness, the fears around a trans body, the misunderstandings and misinterpretations of a trans person, rather than the actual stories, the first-hand accounts, and the examples of how Black trans people lived. So for me, when it comes to archiving, I feel for me, it's impossible to remain passive and inactive. If I remain inactive, if we don't archive ourselves, then those that will archive us will continually erase us as they try and remember us. And this is usually done in which forms they are interested in archiving, as well as what kind of stories with what kind of twist they want to enforce on the image. So usually it's boiling down a Black trans person to trauma or pain. Okay, so where shall we go to next? Sail towards the sun, sail at night, or stay here and wait for the waves to calm? And for those that have just come, your participation is needed for where we're going. And so please write in the public chat where we should go and the majority rules. So whatever the most common thing written is the place we'll go. Sail at night, sail at night, sail at night. Okay, you lot on 9 hours, we'll see. Okay, Sail at Night. And I'm actually going to talk first and then go on. So I put this here. We are living because of our ancestors who aren't. For me, it's actually amazing to remind ourselves of things that we can't see, those that weren't passive in the past, and whose actions have allowed us to create leaps and jumps in our minds when it comes to identity. I often think about who laid the stepping stones that allowed me to identify as a Black trans person, then present myself as a Black trans person, and then further challenge binary systems. And I think a lot about the first person who transitioned, or the first person who mentally thought about transitioning, or the first person or the first society that saw it as something scary and then accepted it, or the first society that had no gender. And all those invisible stepping stones that actually lead to us being able to say the word identity and choose what that means for ourselves. So for me, those people, although their labor is completely lost, it's crucial to think about these unarchived steps that have been taken, that have been stored somewhere in our body. Somewhere in our body, these memories live. This fight back against this system that we're currently in lives. And it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a foundation of people continually challenging certain status quos or certain ideas or certain limitations on their bodies or on their lives or on how they want to live. And so I believe that we're here because of our trans sisters who aren't, because they put on all the work for us to even remain here. And they lost their lives in many different ways, some of them tragic, some of them not, some of them lived out their lives. But we don't even know. We have no knowledge of how they lived, how they existed, and how they would like to be remembered. But we do know that the steps that they took, the steps that we take for granted when we think about transitioning or when we think about the word trans, they actually laid all that down for us. They laid a load of conversation that never even occurred, maybe in their time. And a quick thing here. I always say this, but for me, there's power in not passing. And the reason this is here is because when I think about the idea of like a mental transition, the idea of someone transitioning but not being able to carry out that transition physically, I think about what actually is transness and what does that mean and what is not acting on it. And for me, that mental act for transness is an act. It's an actual act that does have repercussions down the line. And so having to make your body look like what society says a trans person looks like is actually another kind of perception, another limitation that's being placed upon non-gendered, non-cis trans bodies that are trying to rebel against this idea of what it means to choose your identity and refuse an identity being put upon you. And so for me, the phrase, you don't have to pass, there is power in not passing, means that when you're trans, when you say you're trans, I believe you. If you say, I am trans, I believe you have done the mental work to even get to that stage. It is not my position to question you, and it's not anyone else's position to question you. And this is the problem with the kind of society we live in, is that often when you talk about your identity, someone wants to see a reflection so they can more easily understand what you mean, and they want a reference to point to and say, okay, you went from this to this. But that's not how transness works, and that's not how it's always been. And this often makes us find it difficult to like love ourselves, you know. But for me, I'm loving every trans person who doesn't want to pass, doesn't need to pass, doesn't even try and pass. It's not about passing, it's about choosing that identity and saying, I don't need to abide by your rules, I have my own rules. And this image I don't want to talk about. We wait till night to sail. As it grows darker, you feel the presence of something else here. The wind begins to whisper in your ear. it becomes incredibly foggy. You can barely see 100 meters in front of you. You and the crew begin to feel threatened by this darkness, and a panic sets in. This was a mistake. Two objects glow dimly in the distance. One looks like the searchlight of a boat. The boat looks like it's searching for something. Maybe it's searching for you. If it is, you are not sure of its intentions when it finds you. The other is a structure of some kind. The light that comes from this is different in a way you don't understand, Its glow gently throbs. So we can either sail towards the boat, sail towards the structure, or send a warning to the boat. And for those that are new that have come, this is an interactive thing. Please write in the chat what your answer is and the majority rules again. Okay, so people have said warning, sail towards the structures. Anyone else writing? No? Okay. Oh, yes, you are. Okay, I'll wait for you. See, now you started writing now. There's no escape. I've seen it. Sail towards the structure. Okay, the structure wins. Okay, sail towards the structure. Okay, so terms and conditions and the path that you chose to walk. Right. So this is when we really get into this idea of having an audience that is passive and refusing that. So when I think about making work, I often think about changing the space. Like, how can I alter the space to hold those that I want to talk about and those that I need in the space? Like, how can you use a gallery space as a Black trans space? How can you do that? How can you make that transition, essentially, for the space? And for me, the thing that works for me, I feel, is the space has a very clear set of terms and conditions. And so the example here says terms and conditions. You must agree to support Black trans people to reap the rewards of being in their presence, accept or decline. And what I mean by this, and how this is usually displayed, is very clearly before you even get into the space. And what this means essentially is that if at any moment someone comes in and doesn't want to support this work, they need to leave. They are welcome to leave. We actively want to make them feel uncomfortable. The only people we're interested in is making Black trans people feel comfortable. And for me, it's important to do that because it sets a change of the feeling of the space, of who's going to be taken seriously, who's going to be really scrutinized, and what it means for you when you step into the space, if you are or you're not Black and trans. And I put this here because I want people to bring the path they've walked into the space. For me, when you're looking at work that talks about a certain political aim or political thing, your history, the history that you are bringing, is projected onto the work. And I don't feel comfortable with you just projecting your history and that being that. You have put something on the work and you don't question it because you have a certain history, you've walked a certain path, you have laid that path and you're laying a new path on top of that work. And for me, it's up to my work, at least, to challenge this and say no. Instead of you getting access to the whole of the work, your choices will affect how long you get to use the work, how long you get to see the work, as well as what you see. So I don't believe in giving everything for everyone at the same time. I believe in accessibility. I believe the work should be easy to access, easy to use, but the choices that you make when looking at the work and when accessing it and looking at it should affect the work. And so what do I mean by that? So later on, I'll talk about my works, but I usually make these essentially video game-esque works that essentially you have to put your identity in, and depending on what identity you pick, will change what you can see and all the other choices you get. And depending on what you can see will determine if we're scrutinizing you or we're giving you something. And sometimes we challenge your privilege, we challenge your position, we challenge your identity, and we get you to write answers and questions out. And other times, if it's a Black trans person, we want to archive something about them. We want to know something about them. We want to give them something. We want to show them something that represents them and holds them. The boat is small. It's a small fishing boat with an old figure on it. They see you approach and smile. Although their skin is almost transparent, their presence is suffocating. They ask us of what story you would like to hear about. So either we have Enter Resurrections Lands or Enter Digging for Black Trans Life. Please put in the chat which one you would like to see. Well, you have to pick it if you get it. Yeah, the explanations are if you get picked. If you don't get picked, you don't get an explanation. Okay, so it's currently, we'll see. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, I'm making notes. Okay, so there's R. D. Okay, it's tied. It's a 3 for Resurrection Lands and 3 for Digging for Black Trans Life. So I think we'll have to break the tie. Who's gonna break the tie? Someone has to move. I'm gonna remain passive. Oh, there we go. Digging for Black Trans Life, it is. Okay, so Digging for Black Trans Life. So I made this work, Digging for Black Trans Life, when I was looking back on Black trans history and actually came across that Mary Jones image. And for those of you that were late, Mary Jones is a Black trans person in 1836, and she is immortalized essentially in a poster warning people about her. And for me, I wrote a story about wishing that we could scan the earth and bring back the memories of Black trans people so that we could talk to them. And this wasn't such a thing as being upset that, like of the current case of what happens to Black trans people now and how our half-life, I say, is essentially shorter, but actually that we don't actually know anything about how Black trans people lived and what they even called themselves and if the society accepted them or not. I do know that the Caribs, before colonialization, they all believed in a single soul. And so they shared the same soul with the earth, and everyone shared that one soul. So there wasn't such a thing as gender. It was more about if you were useful to society. And for me, I know there's more cases like that we just don't know about because they were erased by the current world we live in. And I don't think it's just colonization. I think it's those who had the power at the time and who took part in that society and who were given no choice. We did end up with a binary society that doesn't look, let's say, pleasantly upon Black trans people. And so for me, I wanted to think about if I could bring back Black trans people and talk to them, what would I want to say? What would I want to ask them? Like, what questions would there be? What worries would I have? What anxieties would I maybe be able to alleviate? Are there things that we could share? And there's more just about wishing that I could even have that conversation with someone who's lived in society that has been Black and trans, and for them, the idea that I would have to identify this way is confusing, because they're like, why is it even an identity? Why isn't it just open? And so this was a 40-minute animation alongside a performance, and these are just some of the images. And that's an image of me performing, oh Lord. And I put this in here actually because this is the first time I actually made a work that it was kind of a concept for a game, and I didn't know how to make games yet. And now my hands are gesticulating, but I didn't know how to make games yet. So I'd often have these choices in it, which seemed like choices that you could interact with, but were actually scripted. It's essentially just a film. And there would be a mouse that would go around and click it. And it was at this moment when in the performance, I stayed in there 8 hours a day, and I would perform for an hour or once every 4 hours or something like this. But a lot of the conversations I would get were that people were ignoring the trans stuff, and people were saying, can you just take the trans stuff out? We don't like it, or I'm bored, or I just find it very attractive, but I don't find the topic important. And for me, I was having a difficulty in that people were able to be passive about something that they should not be passive about. And I wanted to completely refuse that. And so from this point, I started making work that required you to make all the decisions. And instead of me being the focus, of a trans person in the room being in focus, you as the person picking the work can be the focus. And in that way, it can center Black trans people when it needs to, and it can not center white cisness when it shouldn't. And this is an example of its installation. So through this journey, you learn the power of digging. We don't know what to do with this. Maybe it'll help you when you get to the wound. After learning about all this, you know where to go, and we decide to sail towards the wound. Okay, so we are here because of those that are not. I'm going to put the link in the chat. You can play it later. This is my first, I would say, archive that I made. And it's called We Are Here Because of Those That Are Not, or blacktransarchive.com. And essentially what it is that we worked with around 15 different Black trans people to create an interactive archive. And so all the characters were designed by different people, all the landscapes were designed by different people. And then this was kind of mushed together into a speculative fiction fantasy story. And it was dedicated to Black trans existence, but the first thing you do when you play is you have to pick your identity. And this is the point where I feel we managed to get rid of a passive observer, because a lot of these choices here would completely remove you from the experience. Obviously, if you pick Black and trans, it's not going to do that. But in the cis option, there were so many times where if your actions were not supportive of a Black trans environment, then you would be kicked out. What was really nice about this is that everyone could watch you play. And so people would often watch people play and be removed, and then be able to take up that space, the space in the chair themselves. And for me, this is a really important part of archiving that is often not done. Archives are often seen as maybe neutral and usable in any way that seems fit to the person who's accessing it. But for me, there's a lot of problems when people misuse information in the archive. And often people are looking for an image to fit what they are writing about, rather than actually to use the contextualization of that image as a starting point to write about that image. I was speaking to someone who runs a trans archive online, more of a formal one, and they were saying one of the biggest things that they have to do is constantly go into people's DMs and go into people's websites and email them and say, you've misused this image is incorrectly used, or you're using the archive inappropriately. And so I wanted to build something in that that didn't allow people to do that, didn't allow people free reign to have fun and to do this kind of exploration into transness without having any side effects. But instead, as they selected, the archive forms an idea of who they are and can then respond exactly to who they are and what they're saying and their choices that they're making. Finally, just ahead of us is the wound. Finally, we come across the wound. It's a hole in the sea, a void that refuses to close. Even the water is scared of what lies in the wound as it twists and turns away from the void. The currents begin to pull us towards the wound, and only now do you and your crew begin to wonder what is in the wound. Discuss what is in the wound. You must discuss this before you enter the wound. Okay, so seeing as you lot are not the most, I mean, it's very hard for you to discuss this because I don't know if you can turn your cameras on. Maybe this can be a chance for some questions before we continue, if you have any. Is the wound related to people who have lost their lives at sea? Maybe. So for me, the wound is related to how the sea can't remember anything. It's impossible for the sea to have a trace of what's actually happened on it unless you can dive down underneath it. And there's so much at the bottom of the sea or swept into the crevices of the ocean. 75% of our world is water. That actually we don't actually know what's happened on these seas. And there has been a lot of people that have lost their life on it, but there's also been a lot of land that's been overtaken by the sea. There's also been a lot of people that use the seas in ways that we don't know. We only have a certain history of people who were documented in a specific way that we can actually draw and understand. For example, pirates. There's only a very set amount of history that we know of pirates because of the archiving back then. And we do know about the slave trade and how people were carried across the ocean, but we don't actually know about how Black people use the sea. We don't know about how Black people were using the sea and traveling across the sea, irrespective and away from this colonial idea. That's what we're taught, is how they were carried across the sea rather than how they carried themselves across the sea. So the wound in the sea is more about this loss of history that's insanely deep, that no matter how far we go down, we'll never be able to get anything back, really, and we'll never be able to patch it up. But it's not all sad. It's just that it's not all about death and gloom. It's more about that this history is lost, and even going in the wound, you won't find it. Any other questions? I hope that kind of answered your question. People shy? Don't be shy. I'm not shy. I see you typing. Good question. Are the wound spaces to breathe? That's a really good question. For me, it's a difficult one. Yes and no. So for me, the more we talk about these things, the more we try and speculate on the past history of, for me, Black trans history, the more breath it gives us and gives those who are Black and trans in the future. Often feel like we're not given enough room to even talk about our past or imagine our past or write a narrative about Black trans people in the past. And often when we're asked to write something, it's usually about why you're trans and medicalizing your body and whatnot. But instead about speculating on larger, more grand scales. And when I think about doing that, when I think about using storytelling to create a world in which only centers Black trans people, and in which Black trans people can imagine themselves in and want to live in, and transport themselves back in time to that place, or forward in time, wherever this is. It gives us more space to breathe in terms of representation, in terms of understanding how a world could hold us, and gives us a better idea of how we can think towards the future rather than having to always think we're starting from scratch. Any other questions? I hope that kind of answered it in a way. I'll give everyone 10 seconds to put a question in. If you don't want a question, we'll move on. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wow, thank you for your questions. Enter the wound. Okay. It's cold in here. There is no sound. A load of images flash before you, but you can't make sense of any of them. The wound has you. Speak to the wound. A figure comes out the darkness. You shouldn't be here, they say. You're not ready to be here yet. You must go. You're lucky I found you. So I want to briefly just talk about why sometimes looking into the past is I wouldn't say like a good way, I don't know. For me, when I look into the past in terms of technology, I often see ways in which we can speak about ourselves that have really been used by us because we weren't given the opportunity at the time. So, for example, this is something called ASCII graphics. So graphics when you make a graphic or an image out of text, all the text on your keyboard. And for me, this can hold a lot. Like you can hold a lot by actually using text to talk about Black trans people, to talk about an identity, to name an identity without having to say it, to make something interactive, interactive, simple, and just using text to hold both the stories, the feelings, the emotions of a Black trans person, as well as the clearly seeing that someone is Black and trans without having to like spell it. I mean, you are spelling it out, but without having to like make it clear like what that means. And I often look back into the early development of games, the early development of tech, and how most of these industries were just white men having fun with all their money. And actually, a lot of the technologies they just used and chucked away when you got a new one, used and chucked away. And actually, they didn't use it in a way that we might actually be able to talk and challenge the views that we currently have, as well as how we interact with stories and how we tell and record stories. For me, something of the past is how ASCII-based graphics and those games were such a good place to talk about identity and actions and inaction that have been completely untapped. Same with like the Doom engine, same with all these old games, have all these old engines that actually would be a really great way to store and remember a Black trans person, but have actually just not been used to. And so something that I am doing now is looking back on these old engines and saying, I'm going to use that exact same technique and see if it's an effective way of archiving. And that's kind of my practice, is continuously looking at new ways of trying to archive Black trans experience and trying to remember it. And knowing that settling down on one form will not work. Get out of here. Oh no. You're too late. The ships have found you. We have no way of escaping them. Our journey ends here. We won't be able to close this wound. And that kind of brings me to the end of the talk. I don't know if you have any questions or any comments. I'm happy to hear any of them. But thank you for participating also. So, are there any questions or anything? Because I can just talk forever, but hopefully I'm making some sort of sense. I see you typing. Oh. You can also say something mean, I don't mind. Well, if you're typing very long or you don't know exactly what to type. How do we maintain a space to remember how the seas were navigated? That's a really good question. Thank you. No, there's no roars and delay. I'm just taking the mic. How do we maintain the wound have to close? I mean, since the battle never ends. Okay, so first off, how do we maintain how we navigate the seas? I don't think we can maintain something that we don't currently have. We can't remember it currently, but maybe if you're talking about how we use them now, I think something like map, something that an artist called Eben Sadipo is doing a whole thing on this, actually, a whole thing on navigating the seas and looking at how you can navigate the water using the stars, and actually who those stars can be. And for them, they're kind of drawing a parallel between calling stars different Black trans people that have enabled them to navigate transness and their identity, as well as looking at how Black people did use the stars to navigate and drawing a map on those and using those parallels. So I think it's about making, for me, it could be like relics, it could be, because I don't think it's ships. I don't think it's ships that it is, because I am also thinking of people who have rivers. I'm also thinking of traveling between the Caribbean. I'm also thinking about swimming. I'm also thinking about all of those things. So for me, it's more of this, like this navigation, what's being carried across the ocean. It's a very hard thing, but I think it's, for me, I instantly come to maps, and I instantly come to like a map of an ocean drawn by a Black trans person, a route that they took, what happened on that route, that journey, the water, like what was the water? And I know it's very loose, but for me, that's what comes to my mind. It's a really good question. I don't think I exactly have an answer to it. Does the wound have to close? No, I mean, the wound won't close. I don't think it will. I don't think it will close. I think it doesn't have to close, because of the wound and because it's endless. I think we can draw a lot from it. And often I feel sad about what we don't have, like what the history is that we don't have. But also I know that there's a lot of us living now that are making history, and that is the history I want to maintain and make sure we maintain, so that we don't have another wound, that we said, we missed a moment. And when we look back and say, that's not how that person actually lived, it's like, well, we didn't do the work to actually remember that person. So I want us to do the work to remember how people are living now, so that we don't create more of these holes in history, and so that Black trans people 200 years from now have something to reference back to. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and have a lovely evening. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. And take care. Oh, and you can also you can play any of the works on my website. I can't remember who said, but Resurrection. If you're interested in Resurrection Land, type in resurrectionland.com and you can play it. And so you'll be able to understand exactly what's happening there. Yeah, so thank you so much. Take care.